this video, I'll be talking all about knitting swatches. Knitting a swatch is important to be able to test your fabric and get accurate finished measurements of the item you want to knit. There are a few different ways to make knitting swatches. 3 of my favorite methods are doing mini test swatches, a flat gauge swatch, and a gauge swatch that simulates knitting in the round. Before you make a swatch, you will need to choose the needles that you want to use. There are circular needles, double pointed needles, and also flat needles, which I don't have any, so I will insert a photo here. And each of these could be made with different materials like wood or metal. So choose your preferred or required needle and make sure to use the same needle that you will be using to knit your final project. If you're following a pattern, you can start with the type of needle and needle size that is suggested in the pattern, or you can look at your yarn ball label. In this case here, on my yarn ball, it suggests that I use a 4mm needle or US 6 needle. For the mini swatches, I will make a swatch that's just a couple inches wide and long, and I would not use these to measure my gauge for my pattern. But I would use these just to see in general how the fabric is looking and how the density of the fabric is, as well as using this as a chance to test different needle sizes. One swatch is knit with 3mm needles, and the other swatch is knit with 5mm needles. And with this, we can see that we have a denser fabric on the swatch on the right and a looser, more drapey fabric with the swatch on the left. And if you want to test this yourself, you can try grabbing your swatch and you just gently push the fabric together until it folds. And you'll find that with a denser fabric, you'll have more resistance when you try to fold it, and it's more stiff. Whereas a looser, more drapey fabric will bend really easily and not have much resistance at all. So if you find that your mini swatch ends up being too dense, then to fix this, you can size up your needle size. And in this case, if you have too loose of a fabric, you'll want to size down your needle size. Once you have a fabric that you like and you know the needle size that you're going to use, you can move on from your mini swatches to knitting your gauge swatch. Here I have my 2 gauge swatches. So these are both knit using 4mm needles as suggested on the yarn label. And I knit these in stockinette stitch, which is the most common stitch you will see used to get a gauge measurement from. But you can also do swatches in all different stitch patterns, depending on what your pattern calls for or what stitch pattern you want to use in your finished item. You'll also see that swatches normally have a border of garter stitches, or in this case, ribbing. And this is because stockinette stitch has a tendency to curl in if you don't have a border on it. So to make it easier, we add a border so that our swatch will lay flat, and then we can take our measurements much easier that way. Knitting gauge is also almost always measured over 4 inches or 10 centimeters of fabric. So you must also make sure that the gauge swatch is larger than 4 inches by 4 inches. So normally something around 6 by 6 inches is going to be a good size, because this allows you to have the border around the edge, and then you can measure your gauge in the middle of your fabric. Now this swatch is knit flat, meaning that I'm knitting and then I turn my work and then continue. In this case, I purl back and then turn my work and knit again and continue like that. And this is important because this is different than knitting in the round. Because knitting in the round, you're always only knitting stitches. So we want to make sure our swatch is knit in the same way that our final item will be knit. So that would be either flat or in the round. If you have a pattern that has both of these elements in it, you could do a gauge swatch of both, or you could do a gauge swatch of whichever is used more in the pattern. For example, if you have a sweater that's mainly knit in the round, you can go with a gauge swatch like this that simulates knitting in the round. But if you're making something like a cardigan that's mostly knit flat, then you can go with a flat gauge swatch. Now, to knit a flat gauge swatch is pretty straightforward, so I won't demonstrate that because you just knit back and forth as you normally do when knitting flat. But if you want a quick way of doing a gauge swatch that simulates working in the round like this, then I'll demonstrate that next. So here, I have a mini swatch that I casted on to my circular needles. And at first, I just knit the border of ribbing flat. And then next, you just start by knitting your border stitches at the edge and then knitting across as you normally would. And when you get to your border stitches, again, you just knit your border stitches either in garter stitch or ribbing, whatever you prefer. And then to simulate knitting in the round, we're not going to be turning our work. What we actually do is slide our work to the other needle. Like this. And now you have your working yarn over here. So what we want to do next is leave a long piece of yarn in the back. Like this. So you can see this piece here. And you want to make sure this is long enough that you're able to lay your knitting flat. So leave that in the back. And now you just start again and knit your border stitches and then knit across. And that's it. And you just keep repeating the step of once you finish your row, you slide your work back to the other needle and leave a tail like this in the back. You might need to pull this yarn a little bit to tighten up these edge stitches here, but we don't really care too much because we don't measure our gauge from these anyways. But then that's it. Now this will simulate knitting in the round because you will only be knitting your stockinette stitches. You won't be flipping your work and knitting a row and then purling a row. So on a full size gauge swatch, you'll have something like this where you have at least 4 inches of fabric in the middle that you can measure your gauge. And on the back, you'll have these loops here that are loose enough that it doesn't pull in your fabric like this. They're loose enough that I'm able to let my fabric lay flat. And you can still, since they're attached like this, you can still unravel your swatch later and use this yarn. I know some people might also like take these pieces and cut them, but if you do that, you can't reuse the yarn after. So it's up to you if you want to do that or not, but I prefer to leave it like this so that I can still use the yarn if I need it. Now, before you measure your gauge, you also need to wash and block your swatch. Now you want to make sure again that you're washing and blocking your swatch the same way you would with your final finished item. So for this, you could refer to your yarn label. For example, on this yarn here, it gives you some washing instructions. on if this yarn can be machine washed or hand washed. So if you choose to hand wash your yarn for your final item, then hand wash your swatch. And if you're going to put your final finished item in the washing machine, then also wash your swatch in the washing machine. Because washing your swatch can definitely change your gauge, as the fabric can stretch out a little bit. So you never want to measure your gauge on an unwashed swatch. So after you've washed your swatch, you don't want it to be soaking wet, so you will dry it out a little bit. And one common way is to just take a towel and just fold it over onto your knitting gently. You don't want to be super aggressive with this, and then just press out the water from the swatch. And this is the same method you can use with your actual knit items as well. So once your swatch is almost dry or slightly damp, then you can move to blocking it. So once you have your slightly damp swatch, you can pin it out with little T-pins like this and pin it to your blocking mat. So you put one pin in each corner and then a couple pins on each side to help hold the gauge swatch flat and also try and keep it straight. And blocking helps to even out your stitches, and it helps to let your stitches dry in the correct shape. You also don't want to put too much tension on your swatch. So you can see if I remove this pin, it still stays almost in the same place. Like I'm not putting tension that I'm pulling the swatch like this, just a little bit so that it's going straight. Now you can leave your swatch like this to air dry, or you could use a steamer. So for example, this is a steamer, a clothing steamer. And you just have to be careful with this, because with the steamer, it doesn't react well with all yarns. Normally this is something that's good for natural yarns like wool and cotton, but things like synthetic yarns might not react well with the steamer, so you do have to be careful with that. But that is an option. You could either let your swatch air dry, or you could use the steamer, slightly give it some steam, and then let it dry. And this will really help open up your stitches and let everything lay flat and nice. And now it'll be ready to take your gauge measurement. Now, when you normally measure your gauge, you're usually going to be told to measure over 4 inches. This is because if you measure only within 1 inch, this might not be accurate, because you might get 4 stitches per inch in 1 inch, but then the next one you might get 5 stitches per inch. And so really you should be getting 4.5 stitches per inch, for example. So when you measure over more inches, you're getting a more accurate gauge. And to measure your gauge, you're going to need a ruler. And I would recommend using a solid, rigid ruler like this, because there are like flexible rulers as well, or measuring tapes, but those could stretch over time. So to make sure you're getting the most accurate gauge measurement, I would use a rigid ruler like this. Now, to measure your number of stitches, you're going to look at how many stitches you have within 4 inches. And each stitch, you'll see it looks like a little V. So you'll want to place the beginning of your ruler at the start of one of those V's. And then you just count each stitch until you reach 4 inches. So in this case, I have 19.5 stitches within 4 inches. And the last one is 0.5 because it lands on half of a stitch. So the end of the 4-inch mark lands right in the middle. So I'll count this as just half of a stitch. So now to measure the number of rows, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to place the beginning of your ruler at the top of a V here, and you're just going to count the number of rows like this. So this is the first row, second row, third row, and continue down until you count all the stitches within 4 inches. So in this case, I have 27 stitches, I have 27 rows within 4 inches. So now that you have your gauge for your swatch, in this case, it is 19.5 stitches by 27 rows. You can compare that to your pattern and see if you need to adjust your needle size. Or you can also compare it to the yarn ball that you have. So in this case, I'm pretty close. I have 19.5 stitches and I also have 27 rows. So this can also be helpful because it can tell you if naturally maybe you are a tight knitter or a loose knitter, if you're getting a gauge that is off from what is recommended on the ball. And finally, if you are looking into designing a knitting pattern for yourself based off of the gauge that you got, you're going to want to turn your gauge into a number of stitches or rows per inch or per centimeter. And you don't want to do this by measuring over 1 inch or over 1 centimeter on your swatch itself, because this can be inaccurate. So what you'll actually do is divide your number of stitches or number of rows to achieve that. So for example, I have 19.5 stitches over 4 inches in my gauge swatch. So to get the number of stitches per inch that I can use for my pattern math, I will divide that by 4 because we measured it over 4 inches. If you measured over 10 centimeters and you want it per centimeter, you can divide this number by 10. So 19.5 divided by 4 is going to give me 4.875 stitches per inch. And this is the number I'll be using to calculate my pattern math with. I wouldn't recommend rounding it, because if you round it and you start multiplying your numbers, you might end up with extra stitches or less stitches than you are intending to have. So to be the most accurate, I would leave the decimals there and just use that number. And same thing for the number of rows. In this case, I'm using inches. So I will take 27 rows that I have over 4 inches, and I will divide it by 4, and that'll give me 6.75 rows per inch. And now I can use these two numbers to continue and do some pattern math. But that's it. This has been everything that you need to know about gauge swatching, and now you can go ahead and start your knitting.